Gary, can you explain to our audience the role of a religious freedom ambassador? What exactly is that?
George, this was created by the Religious Freedom Act back in 1998. Congress approved that act. And in that act, there's a requirement that there be an ambassador at large for religious freedom. Now, the task of the ambassador is to head up the State Department that looks at international religious freedom. And he directs that, and then each year they investigate persecution around the world in various countries, not just against Christians, but all religious minorities.
I mean, we're talking Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists.
Yazidis, all faiths.
Yeah.
And then they issue an annual report.
So why is this role so important?
Well, it's important because if we believe in religious freedom, as we do here in America, then we have to do something about it, don't we?
Yeah.
Or at least urge others to do something about it, especially in relations with countries. Are we going to deal with a country continually, maybe money-wise, give them money if they're persecuting religious minorities in their country?
Now, this position has been, as you mentioned, has been in place since the 1990s. Has it really made a difference? Does the ambassador at large, when he makes his recommendations to the White House, can the president then put some teeth to this recommendation?
Well, the law requires that something be done if a country is found to be a persecutor or in violation of religious freedom. And that can range from everything from criticizing the country publicly to all the way of implementing sanctions, imposing sanctions against that country. So there are a number of steps that can be taken, that must be taken by the president.
Let me ask you this. Have previous administrations, whether it was 8 years under the Obama administration or the George W. Bush administration, has it made any difference, this particular post and this particular department?
I think it always makes a difference when you can speak out. When you speak out about violations and you bring it to the attention of the world. But in addition to that, look at the case of Vietnam. Vietnam is one country that became a country of particular concern. A lot of noise made about Vietnam, and Vietnam backed off. There was a slight improvement in religious freedom there in Vietnam. Now it's gone the wayside a little bit at this point, but when we bring it to the attention of the world, something is done. There is pressure put on.
To this very point, the position has been vacant since the administration, since a switch over between the Obama administration and the Trump administration.
Brief period of time.
Yeah, exactly.
But that has not always been the case. President Obama, unfortunately, did not. This was not a priority for him. And when he first came into office in 2009, January 2009, did you know, George, that it was 2 years later that we actually had an ambassador at large for religious freedom? And then when that ambassador resigned, Suzanne Johnson Cook, another 14 to 15 months went by before there was a replacement, David Saperstein.
And now, under this new administration, a number of members of Congress, from Marco Rubio to James Langford to a number of other folks, Roy Blunt, Steve Daines, they just issued a letter, by the way, to the president, dated February 1st, urging the president to fill this particular role. And they have made it very, very clear that given the extreme persecution of religious groups around the world, an ambassador has to be appointed. What kind of a person are evangelical Christians, Gary, looking for in this particular role?
I think they're looking for someone who has experience in this area. Someone who has been fighting and working hard in the area of religious freedom. Also someone that is knowledgeable about the world and the countries that they're going to be dealing with. And someone who's a hard worker who will go after them aggressively. Not just go, oh, there might be religious freedom here, but or lack of it, we won't do much.
Let me just point out that in this letter by a number of members of the political establishment in Congress, they said, quote, "The nominee must have significant foreign policy experience and understanding the relationship between religious freedom and national security. It is also critical that the ambassador is vested with the authority and the resources necessary for success." Speak to that point. The person who President Trump will appoint must have an understanding not just about national issues here in the United States, but also foreign policy and how it affects not just Christians, but other faith groups.
You know, George, I think it's also important that they look at someone who has a knowledge of other faith groups. Maybe they're a Christian, but they have knowledge and relationship with Buddhists. They have knowledge and relationship with Hindus and Muslims and other minority faiths, Yazidis even.
Yeah.
Have they been to Iraq? Have they talked with the Yazidis? Do they know the plight of people, groups like the Yazidis? So that's very important. But George, I've got to say, it is crucial right now that the president act, because Christians and other minority faiths are dying in the Middle East, genocide in Iraq and Syria. The United States even said that it was genocide there, not only against Christians, but also Yazidis and other faith groups.
Let me just point out, this is a very, very important issue, and one that my colleague here, Gary Lane, as well as Dale Hurd and others, Chris Mitchell in Jerusalem, and myself, we've covered for many, many years the plight of not just Christians, but other faith groups that are persecuted for their faith. So it's an important topic for us here at CBN News. So we want you to go to Facebook, drop us your comments, your questions about this particular issue and why it's so significant, and even make your voice known to the administration, why this position, the ambassador at large, is so significant. Let's talk about some of the names that have been floated around in the last few days. Gary, who are they? Who are the top contenders?
Well, look, this isn't official. There was one report that was released recently by Religion News Service, basically saying that you had Kenneth Starr. I don't know if you remember Kenneth Starr. He was the Whitewater investigator, the special prosecutor for Whitewater. He is apparently on the list.
Also with the whole Lewinsky, Hillary Clinton case, right?
The whole thing.
Yeah.
So he was involved in that. And then another person, Nina Shea. Nina Shea is the head of the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute. She's been involved in religious freedom issues for many years.
Very long
and
time.
Let me tell you something, Nina Shea, we wouldn't have a Religious Freedom Act if it hadn't been for her tenacious work on that.
Yeah, she's done a lot of work, and she's been a frequent guest of ours here on CBN News.
Johnny Moore, it's someone else who was mentioned, but he says he hasn't been contacted.
Of the two contenders, if we are to say Ken Starr and Nina Shea, who would Gary Lane prefer?
Hands down, it would be Nina Shea, because Nina Shea is not only an attorney, but she has the experience. She's been an aggressive fighter for religious freedom issues around the world, and very knowledgeable on it, and very outspoken. But let me say, there was one report I saw that says she doesn't want the position.
Really? Okay, interesting.
But there are many others, George, that would be well qualified to fill that ambassadorship.
Let me tell you now, our audience will obviously be very familiar with Gary Lane's work. He has literally covered the four corners of our earth, covering a whole slew of different topics, but one that is very near and dear on his heart is the persecution of Christians around the world. As I mentioned, you have, for many, many years, brought voice to believers around the world. Do you have any recommendations as the president looks at a particular ambassador at large? What are your recommendations?
Well, my recommendation would be someone who has worked this issue, that has been aggressive in fighting and speaking out about religious freedom issues, not just for Christians, but for other minorities, Jews who are terribly persecuted in the Middle East and other places, Buddhists, the Rohingya people, also, believe it or not, in Burma, and you've heard about them. They're a minority there. They've been persecuted, Yazidis and so forth. So not someone that just focuses in on Christians, but has experience speaking and being with people of other faiths.
It is an enormous situation. In fact, President Trump has spoken directly to the issue that he promised, in fact, to our White House correspondent, David Brody, in an exclusive interview, his third that he did when he came into office, basically saying that Christians have been given the short end of the stick, that they have been persecuted, that there's been no one to speak to their plight. In fact, he accused in some ways the Obama administration for sidelining Christians and their plight, and he has promised to speak up on their behalf and to protect them. Is it your sense, Gary, that this is an administration that takes the plight of Christians very seriously, but also the plight of other faith groups that are being persecuted for their faith?
The president is talking the talk, and Mr. President, if you're watching this, act now. It'll be more than just talking, it'll be action. Christians around the world, other minorities, are looking for you to take the lead, and we know that the people who follow us are also very interested in this.
Yeah, let me just make one other point here. on February 1st, as the members of Congress wrote a letter to the president. Close to about 700 Christian leaders and other faith group leaders from the Wilberforce Initiative spoke out, urging the president to nominate this ambassador at large within his first 100 days. This is a very, very important matter to people of faith, not just to Christians, but to others, is an important issue, as I mentioned.
And George, I might add, it's a matter right now of life and death.
Yeah, absolutely.
People are dying,
yeah,
especially in the Middle East, Syria and Iraq.